Hello, everyone. Welcome to Accessibility Talks. Accessibility Talks is a monthly virtual meetup where we come together to discuss topics around all things website accessibility. I am your host, Carrie Fisher, and each month we will feature a guest speaker who will present an in-depth accessibility topic to the group, after which there'll be some time to ask questions and discuss. So again, if you have any questions today for our speaker, please post them in the chat window or tag them on Twitter with the hashtag A11yTalks, spelled A11yTalks. This month, we're happy to have Ashley Bischoff as our guest speaker. Ashley will be talking today about embracing plain language for better accessibility. Ashley is an accessibility expert and copy editor for the Paciello Group. She has a knack for taming technical and business writing, and she is a heartfelt advocate for plain language. She really relishes any chance to comb corporate speak into everyday language. Ashley lives in Dallas, and she likes listening to metal and drinking tea. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Well, let's get started, shall we? I'm just going to share my screen, and we'll be able to kick this off. All right. Fantastic. So, can everyone see my screen? Great. So as Carrie mentioned, I'm Ashley Bischoff, and I'm a copy editor and accessibility analyst with the Paciello Group. And I'd like to talk to you today about how plain language can improve accessibility. Now, for many of us within the field of accessibility, it's not uncommon for us to write things like reports and analysis and documentation, specifications. And those are all good things. But you know what? Our documentation and reports and analysis are only as good as what people can get out of them. And if people find our writing to be too complicated or hard to understand, then they won't be able to make use of our advice no matter how good it is. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, well, what makes some writing more complicated than others? You might even be asking yourself, well, how do I know if my writing is complicated? Well, it turns out that people who study language complexity have narrowed it down to two factors in particular. And it primarily comes down to sentence length and syllables. Now, to give you a better idea of that sort of thing, I thought, let's go through an example of a really bad sentence. So, for example, here's a terrible sentence from WCAG 3.1.5, which says that readability formulas are available for at least some languages when running the spell checkers in popular software if you specify in the options of this engine that you want to have the statistics when it has finished checking your documents. Now, what the fuck does that even mean? And, as we take a closer look at the sentence, we can start to see part of what makes it so hard to get our heads around, namely the sheer enormity of it. Because this sentence is 40 words, which brings me to my first piece of advice, which is that the more complex the material, the shorter the sentences should be. And in fact, experts recommend keeping sentences to between 20 and 25 words. Some recommend closer to 20, some recommend closer to 25, but that's sort of the general ballpark. And the reason that experts recommend this is because when we're presented with a sentence that we're reading, our brain has to ingest that sentence. Our brain has to sort through the words, piece them together, and basically put that puzzle back together to figure out what that sentence means. So when we're faced with a sentence that has 40 some words, we potentially have to ingest all of those 40 words, piece them through, and then try to figure out what that sentence means. And handing off 40 words to someone is a lot to ask of anyone. So that's why experts recommend going for sentences of around this length, between 20 and 25 words. But with that said, you also want some variety to it. I mean, you should probably have a few 35-word sentences and some 3-word sentences. But the main thing is to aim for an average of around 20 some words. So I thought, let's take a look again at that WCAG sentence. And let's see if we can just make it easier to read by breaking it into smaller sentences. So that's what I did. I broke it into a few smaller sentences, made a couple of other small changes. And what that gives us is readability formulas are often available when running the spell checker in your word processor. You can specify options to show those statistics when it's finished checking your document. So we can start to see that sometimes just these smaller changes, like breaking larger sentences into smaller ones, can really make a difference. But you know what? Sentence length is half the battle. Cutting syllables is the other half. Now, you can think of words as being a bit like Tetris pieces. They come in different shapes and sizes. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some are easier to work with than others. And you can think of it in a way that syllables are the building blocks of words. So, for instance, you could think of one-syllable words like being a bit like 2-block Tetris pieces. You can think of 2-syllable words like perhaps update, like being a bit like a 3-block Tetris piece. Or you can think of 3-syllable words as they kind of amount to about a 5-block Tetris piece, and this is where things start to get a bit tricky. Now, for those of you who might be avid Tetris fans, these pieces might look a little bit off to you. And that's because in a standard Tetris game, the pieces max out at 4 blocks. So when we're talking about these 3-syllable words, we're already talking about complexity that's greater than an average Tetris game. But 3 syllables is not the end of the road. I mean, it also comes down to sometimes you've got 4-syllable words, which are a bit like 7-block Tetris pieces, and that doesn't make things any easier. Now, for those who might not be able to see the slides, I thought I might describe a couple of these 7-block pieces. We got one of them that looks sort of like an elongated plus sign. We got one that looks a bit like a donut with a bite taken out of it. And with that said, okay, 4-syllable words, but there are some words that are longer than that. And when it comes to 5-syllable words, well, they're about as much fun as toothpaste with orange juice. And for those who may not be able to see the screen, we have a couple of pieces that look a bit like someone giving a number 1 sign at a sports event. We got one that looks sort of like a circle with a hole in the middle. These are not the greatest Tetris pieces to have to be working with. At this point, you might be thinking, well, what if I have to use a long word? What if there's no way to avoid it? And you know what? I agree. There are some times where long words might be unavoidable. To give one example, the word accessibility has 6 syllables. And it's conceivable that if you were to be writing a report about accessibility, that you may well have to use the word accessibility. And that's okay. Because, you know, if you were to be saddled with one or two of these weird shaped Tetris pieces in a game, you might be able to get by. So using long words occasionally is all right. But with that being said, the game just wouldn't be fun anymore if you were to be handed huge pieces like these over and over and over. So from here, you might be thinking, okay, this starts to make some sense, I guess, but where am I supposed to cut these syllables? How does this work? So I thought I would go through a couple of examples of some corporate speak words and some plain substitutions, just to kind of get the wheels turning for this sort of thing. And while I'm here, I might also mention that plainlanguage.gov has a super handy list of simpler words, where it's a page with complex words in one column, and then in the next column are simpler alternatives. And if you'd want to look at that sometime, you can get to that bit.ly/plain-words. But don't worry too much about writing down URLs and things, because all of my slides are online, and I'll give you the link for that at the end. So even if you miss one of these URLs, we can circle back to that and you'll have a chance to check that out. So hey, let's go through some of these examples. So for instance, one word that you sometimes come across is prior to. This one it's kind of one of those phrases that if you were to see this in a report, you probably wouldn't be surprised. But it turns out that rather than saying prior to, you can just say before. And in doing so, that takes you from 3 syllables down to 2. So as an example of that, someone might be accustomed to saying something like, I proofread the report prior to the meeting. But instead, they might be able to say something like, I proofread the report before the meeting. And you can start to see that even just with these smaller changes, that these sentences become easier to understand, easier to get your head around. All the while, these sentences carrying the exact same meaning. Another one you might come across within reports or documentation is commence. Now, commence is really just kind of a fancy way of saying start. But when you make that change, that takes you from 2 syllables to 1. So for instance, you might be used to project managers hearing something like, we will commence user interviews on Tuesday. But you know, you might try something like, we will start user interviews on Tuesday. Another one that you come across sometimes is sufficient. And in fact, sufficient is one of those words that consultants love talking about things as sufficient. They'll say, oh, this is sufficient. That isn't sufficient. You know what? Rather than saying that something is sufficient or not sufficient, you can also just say enough. And when you make that change, that'll take you from 3 syllables down to 2. So for instance, if you come across a navigation bar that's looking not quite right, rather than saying something like the nav bar doesn't have sufficient contrast, you might try saying the nav bar doesn't have enough contrast. This next one is one of my favorites, and it's in order to. Now, believe it or not, almost every time you come across in order to, you can swap that for 2. And that takes you from 4 syllables and these weird ass Tetris pieces with the donut with the bite taken out of it and the stretched out plus sign, it takes you from those 4 syllables down to 1. Now I can understand you might be thinking, well, what is this alchemy? How do you take 3 words down to just the 1 word? Well, as an example, rather than saying something like, enable grayscale mode in order to see the page without color, you might try saying, enable grayscale mode to see the page without color. This next one, accordingly and consequently. These are sort of the triple word score of word substitutions. Because these are the sort of words that no one actually says in real life. And yet these words turn up in reports and documentation all the time. So when you come across an accordingly or a consequently, take that and try swapping that for so. And by doing that, that takes you from 4 syllables all the way down to 1. So for instance, one might come across an accessibility consultant saying something like, this link isn't focusable, consequently, it isn't accessible. But rather than saying that, try this on for size. This link isn't focusable, so it isn't accessible. This next one is the following. And you know what? I know this may seem a little bit weird, but when you come across the following, you might just try swapping it for this. And yes, I know this seems maybe kind of weird, like this and the following might seem sort of unrelated on the face of it. But when you make that swap, that takes you from 4 syllables down to 1. And at this point, I can understand that an example might be handy because these 2 different phrases may not seem terribly related on the face of it. But when you have something like, use the guidelines in the following table, turns out you can't just say, use the guidelines in this table. Now, I should also clarify that because of pluralization and so on, there may be some cases where rather than saying this, you may need to go with these. And as an example of that, you might have something like, the app supports the following keyboard shortcuts. But you can actually just say, the app supports these keyboard shortcuts. And this is the type of change that just makes these sentences so much easier to get one's head around. Because these simpler versions represent the way people speak in real life. This next one is one that is an easy swap, but it can make a big difference. And that is however. When you come across however at the beginning of a sentence, you can swap that for but. And in doing so, that takes you from 3 syllables down to 1. Now, I can hear what you're saying. I can imagine that you're asking, but Ashley, can I start a sentence with but? Well, as the power vested in me as a copy editor and a grammar expert, I can say that yes, you can absolutely start a sentence with a but. It is completely grammatical and it works. But rather than take my word for it, here's one example. Rather than saying something like, that works in JAWS, however, it doesn't work in VoiceOver, you might try, that works in JAWS, but it doesn't work in VoiceOver. But you know what? Going through these examples, I hope helped a bit, but with that being said, when it comes to syllables, there's actually one trick that makes more of a difference than any of these, and that's contractions. Now, as you may be familiar, contractions are things like taking do not and going to don't, which takes you from 2 syllables to 1, or taking cannot to can't, which takes you from 2 syllables to 1. But you know what? With that being said, I know that some people might be a little skeptical of this. You might be thinking, oh, but my teacher, Mrs. Crabtree, she doesn't like contractions. How am I supposed to use these fancy pants contractions? Well, you know what? One of my fellow copy editors, a fellow named Tom Freeman, he analyzed the corpus of contemporary American English for patterns around how contractions are being used today. Now, the corpus of contemporary American English, it's a database of words. It covers about 2 decades and 450 million words. And it covers sources including newspapers, magazines, TV transcripts. And we're talking about major newspapers and magazines here, things like the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, NPR, CBS. So we're talking about major writing today. And here's what Tom discovered when he looked at newspapers and magazines in particular. He concentrated on newspapers and magazines because these represent how contractions would be used in writing, in published writing today. And when he looked at how they were used in sources like the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, Time Magazine, what he discovered is that don't is used almost 7 times more often than do not. He discovered that can't is used almost 3 times more often than cannot. He also found that doesn't, didn't, and won't are each used almost 3 times more often than their non-contraction forms. And these are within major newspapers, major magazines. And so with those findings, that goes to show that the tide has turned. And what was once avoided in some contexts is now commonplace. But you know what? People who study linguistics, like Wayne Danielson and Dominique LaRosa, they found out decades ago that contractions improve readability. On top of that, style guides have been on board the contraction train for years. For instance, the Chicago Manual of Style says that most types of writing benefit from the use of contractions. If used thoughtfully, contractions in prose sound natural and relaxed, and make reading more enjoyable. You know what? Maybe you're still a little bit skeptical about this. Well, think of it this way. If maybe you're still unsure about these contractions, think back to any sci-fi robot movie and the way that the robot talked. In those types of movies, invariably, movie robots end up saying stuff like, "I will be glad to see them if they do not get mad," rather than saying, "I'll be glad to see them if they don't get mad." And the reason that movie robots do that is because screenwriters know that the easiest way to make anyone sound like a robot is to take away all their contractions. And while that may sound like a cheap trick, it works every time. So the next time that you're writing up something at work, or the next time that you're writing up a blog post, ask yourself this: do I want to sound like an automaton, or do I want to sound like a person? So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, well, this is all well and good, Ashley, but how do I check my writing? How can I see whether it's readable or not? Well, there are algorithms out there based off sentence length and syllables that can calculate a reading grade level for your writing. So this represents how many years of education someone would need to be able to understand what you've written. Now, I should offer a caveat here. I should clarify that these reading grade levels are based off the US education system, which for those who might be joining this presentation who aren't from the US, I'll just mention that the US education grades go from 1 through 12 for public school, followed by perhaps university, which is usually around 4 years, followed by maybe graduate school or what have you. And so when it comes to checking on what you've written, one tool that I like quite a lot is the Readability Analyzer. Now, these readability algorithms that I'd mentioned, they're all published and available to anyone. So anyone can write tools that check writing against the given algorithm. So one thing that I like about the Readability Analyzer is that it's web-based and it's free. And you can get to it at bit.ly/readinganalyzer. And once you load up this page, once you're loading up the Readability Analyzer, you can use it by pasting your text content into the box, and then the site calculates your text's readability numbers. It'll actually come up with a couple of different readability scores. But the readability score that I think is worth concentrating on is the Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level. And that's just because that's one of the more prominent calculations for calculating reading grades. So what I would recommend is to keep your text readable. Aim for a Flesch-Kincaid grade level that's less than 9. Now, I can understand if that might seem a little bit weird, because you might be thinking, okay, well, what if my readers have graduated from high school? Wouldn't that be 12 years? Or perhaps your readers have gone to university, and which would be 4 years on top of that. Theoretically, 16 years of schooling. So you might be thinking, okay, well, where does this 9 come from? Well, it turns out that reading grade calculations represent someone's reading level under ideal conditions. So for example, if you were to have someone who's graduated from high school, which in the US would be 12 years of school, and maybe there are some ideal conditions. Perhaps they had a really great night's sleep and they remembered to eat breakfast, and they're at the office in a quiet room, good lighting, they don't have a care in the world. Yeah, under those ideal conditions, they might be able to just reach their theoretical maximum reading level. But the thing is that real life is not an ideal condition. In real life, maybe you didn't sleep so good last night. Maybe you ate a cookie for breakfast instead of oatmeal, or maybe you skipped breakfast. Maybe there was a traffic jam on the way into work. Maybe you've got fluorescent lights flickering overhead once you're in the office. Maybe there's some sales guy on his cell phone down the hallway. Or maybe there's a leaf blower running outside. Or maybe you're worried about how your kid's going to do on their math test on Tuesday. All of these factors tend to tug down from our maximum reading level. So what this means is that for most people, they can comfortably read at around 5 grades below their theoretical maximum reading level. So in the United States, for someone who's graduated from high school, which would be 12 years, you can start to see how this 9 comes into play. Because while they theoretically might, under ideal conditions, be able to read at a 12th grade level, there are no ideal conditions. Life is not ideal. And so chances are grade 9 would be their more comfortable reading level. And in fact, there's research that backs this up too, that Doak and Doak, when they studied this, discovered that, yeah, about 4 to 5 years below someone's maximum education level is about the ceiling for where most people can comfortably read from day to day. So at this point, I thought back to that terrible WCAG sentence from earlier. And I thought, hey, let's put that through the readability analyzer to see what we'd come up with. And it comes up with a Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level of 12. So this means, of course, that for someone who's graduated from high school, they wouldn't be able to understand that sentence because it's far above their average reading level. But what this also means is that suppose someone went to high school and then university. So theoretically, under ideal conditions, they might have 16 years of schooling. But once you subtract 5 years of that to account for everyday conditions, it turns out, you know what? They would struggle with this sentence too. So if you've ever been reading through WCAG or other W3C documentation, and if you've been thinking to yourself, man, how do I get my head around this? Am I just a dummy? Well, it's not you, it's the writing. So at this point, you might be wondering, well, how does this play out in real life? How does this affect the real world? Well, here's something to think about. Have you ever wondered how well emergency weather alerts might go over if they were written at a college reading grade level? Well, that's actually what happened. Researchers studied the weather alerts from the National Weather Service, and yeah, it turns out that they're written at a college reading level. So here's one example of an actual weather alert. It says, we are becoming optimistic that the Carolinas and the Mid-Atlantic states will avoid the direct effects of Hurricane Joaquin. However, we cannot yet completely rule out direct impacts along the East Coast, and residents there should continue to follow the progress of Joaquin over the next couple of days. You know what? That paragraph has a Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level of 13.4. So that means that someone who's gone to high school probably wouldn't really be able to understand that. Of course, what this also means is that because life isn't an ideal condition, that people with a college education probably would also struggle to get their heads around that. So think of it this way. We've had a couple of big hurricanes over the past year, such as in Houston and Puerto Rico. And sometimes you hear in the news about how some people haven't evacuated. And, it's easy to blame the victim. It's easy to say to yourself, oh, they should have known. Why did they leave? There's a hurricane coming. But when you think of it in this light, when you consider that they may not have understood the warnings that were being given to them. And some people, they may have stayed behind because they weren't able to understand what was being said about the impending danger. And the effect of all this is that because the National Weather Service has this hoity-toity writing style, that may have cost people lives. Because there may have been some people who didn't really know how dire the situation was. And it wasn't their fault that they weren't able to understand this, because it was written at a far higher reading grade level than even someone with a college education would be expected to understand right away. So with that being said, can we do any better? So what I did was I took a stab at this weather alert from the National Weather Service, and I thought, let's try some of these techniques. Let's try breaking into smaller sentences. Let's try using fewer syllables. Let's try introducing some contractions, and let's see if it might be any easier to read. So here's what I came up with. Chances are getting better that Joaquin won't affect the Carolinas or the states from New York through Virginia. But we can't yet rule out that the East Coast could still be affected. So those who live on the East Coast should keep following our updates about Joaquin over the next few days. So some of the changes there, for example, is that rather than referring to the mid-Atlantic states, because who knows what that means, I spelled out New York through Virginia. I also took that however at the beginning of that one sentence and changed it to for but, and I incorporated some contractions there. And this revised version, how well did it do? Well, this one has a Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level of 7.6. So this means that there's a very good chance that someone with a high school education will be able to understand that warning. Which brings me to a bonus tip. You might be seeing that 7.6 and maybe you're thinking, well, that's kind of low, isn't it? Is that all right? Well, I can reassure you, don't ever worry about a reading grade being quote unquote too low. Don't think that because you're writing for someone at a college education level, that your writing also has to be at a college level. And that's because when you do this, when you write whatever you may be writing, aim for a reading grade level that's the most inclusive. Lower numbers are almost always better when it comes to this. And that's because no one has ever complained that something was too easy to read. So if you're writing something and you run it through the readability analyzer and it comes up with a reading grade of maybe 5 or 6 or 7, that's great. Good work. You've done it. So let's recap. When you're writing, try to aim for an average sentence length of 20 some words. On top of that, keep an eye out for any 3 and 4 syllable words. I say that because when you're perhaps just starting out with this, it can be kind of intimidating if you're facing perhaps an entire report and you're thinking, I don't even know where to start. Well, as a starting point, try to look for those 3 and 4 syllable words to see if you can correct those, because any little bit helps. On top of that, use contractions early and often. And what I would also recommend is double checking what you've written. Using the readability analyzer, you can check on its reading grade level. And that's a good way to sort of a sanity check to see whether your writing is suitable for your audience. Thanks a bunch. I'll mention a couple of links here. I said earlier that all of my slides are online, and they are online right now. You can get to these slides at bit.ly/better A11y. There's also that list of simpler words from plainlanguage.gov, and that's at bit.ly/plainwords. And then there's Wikipedia's list of simpler words, which You wouldn't think of Wikipedia as being a great resource for such a thing, but it actually has a pretty great list too of complex words along with simpler alternatives. And lastly, if you may be interested, you can follow me on Twitter. I gab about language at Friendly Ashley. And I also talk about accessibility at Hand Coding. And you can follow me either or both of those. And just to put this out there, if you're dipping your toes into the plain language waters and you're trying to get a feel for things, you know, if you have some questions about, am I doing this right? Or is this the right direction to go with this sentence? Is this sentence a good, simpler version? You know, feel free to tweet me anytime. I'm happy to help out. Or even if you have a particularly thorny sentence and you're like, I know this is hard to read, but I don't know how to fix it. If you come across one of those, feel free to tweet it to me. I'll be happy to lend a hand because, you know, plain language is really about the long game, much like accessibility as a whole. And I feel that each time we can make improvements, even if they might be smaller improvements at first, each improvement helps get us to where we're going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashley, for presenting today. I have a few questions from the audience I'm seeing on Twitter and in Slack. So I'll ask those first, but again, and just a reminder to anyone who may have a question about Ashley's talk, put them in the chat window on the side if you're going live, or if you're on Twitter, you can do it again at A11yTalks, so A11yTalks. So the first question I have is from Amy, June, and Jeff. What are some of the differences between written and spoken accessibility? And do they matter as much in spoken word? I know we talked a little bit more about writing today, but do you have any?
Sure. I think that's actually a great question. And I think that so often when people are writing, it can be easy to get inside your own head. It can be easy to think to yourself, oh, this is important, so it should sound important, quote unquote, whatever that might mean. But you know what? One of the best ways to make your writing approachable is to imagine that you're at maybe a neighbor's barbecue, sitting across a picnic table from your neighbor, and you're just talking to them about this topic. And sometimes I'll even imagine to myself, okay, just kind of pantomiming, how would I say this to someone in real life? And then I write down those words. And it may seem like kind of a simple thing, but it can make a huge difference. So I think both writing and speaking, I mean, they're both important, but I think a lot of people have perhaps an innate ability to speak clearly, but sometimes it can be easy to get tangled up when it comes to writing. But by using that sort of trick, you can kind of take what you would have said and writing it down. That can actually work.
Yeah, and that kind of goes along those same lines of, when do you use this approach? Are you talking about using this approach in everyday, all kinds of content, prose, like essays, anything, Twitter? I mean, I know we're chatting a little bit and you'll have to catch up later. I know you're presenting, but contractions, for instance, I was taught years ago to not use contractions informally, to spell them all out. Is that just something we should just ignore, like buck the traditions and keep going, you know?
Right. So as you had alluded, some people were taught in years past that contractions weren't as good, but contractions are actually great because contractions represent the way that we speak in real life. And the way I think of it is that suppose you're on a conference call with a client, it wouldn't be unusual to say, I don't think we'll have to reschedule the meeting. That would be a normal thing to say. And if that's good enough for a conference call with a client, why not, if you have to write an email to a client, you could just as easily say, I don't think we'll need to reschedule the meeting. And so, yeah, I think that plain language and more straightforward ways of communicating are suitable for everything, because in a manner of thinking about it, I would only use plain language when you want people to understand what you're saying. So in other words, all the time.
Mhm.
So if you're writing tweets, if you're writing a report, if you're writing up documentation, if you're writing up a specification, please, for the love of God, write it in plain language. Because what that helps people do is it helps your readers understand what you're trying to get across.
Well, and that kind of ties into this new question from Andrew in the chat box. He asks, how about long words that are well known, say vegetarian, which is 5 syllables, but seen everywhere, like cafes, supermarkets, magazines? Would these
Mm-hmm.
rules apply to them as well? Or versus,
Yeah.
it's almost the same thing as, sorry, as accessibility, right? Where some people
Mm-hmm.
call it ally or do an acronym. So,
Sure. I think that vegetarian is a great example, perhaps like accessibility, of a word that doesn't really have a suitable shorter version. And like a Tetris game that has the occasional larger piece, if you have writing that occasionally has a larger word like vegetarian or accessibility, that could be okay. And quite understandably, if you're writing about accessibility, it might be unavoidable to not use accessibility. So I think these longer words, when used occasionally, and if there's no other good option for substitutes, it can be fine.
all right. I was just asking to see if there's any more questions for Ashley today. Any last minute questions? I mean, this has been a great presentation. I know that internally at my organization, Hook 42, like we really, a lot of people wanted to come to this presentation, and I was surprised in Twitter, all the people who wanted to come to this presentation, and if they can't come today, they want to watch the YouTube video later, because this is something that affects people beyond just the development process and beyond the
Mm-hmm.
design process. When you think about accessibility, those are probably the first 2 things you think about. But this is a way for those people who maybe aren't doing direct design and development to be involved in the accessibility process. So this is wonderful. I'm glad that you've given this talk and given them an opportunity to learn more about how they can contribute also.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And just to touch on what you were saying, I think I agree absolutely that for people who perhaps aren't developers themselves or don't work with as much on the development side of things, plain language is a great way that they too can lend a hand and help out. That maybe you don't feel comfortable writing the specification or some documentation, but perhaps you might be able to help out with going back through documentation that's been written and maybe helping to make it easier for other people to understand. I think that is something that helps everyone. And similarly, likewise, for people who are developers, people who are perhaps writing specifications or documentation, I think they too can make use of this sort of thing because it makes their recommendations that much easier for other people to get their head around.
That's definitely true. And you alluded earlier to some of the WCAG 2.0 guidelines and W3C guidelines and how they can become very wordy. And so it's nice to have somebody in the
Mhm.
middle to kind of translate that into everyday speak and say, okay, what is this really saying? And how can I, because they want to, you know, get that guideline. They want to check that box off. They want to do that point, but they don't actually really fully understand what exactly they're asking. So I love this idea of translating to like the developers translating some of that into.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Right. Fantastic. Well, I had a wonderful time and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. And just a reminder, all those links are on the side in the chat window. They'll also be a part of the recording on YouTube later. So you can have many opportunities. And if not, tweet at A11yTalks or at Ashley. Again, those links are in the chat box. So
Mm-hmm.
you do that. And if you have any follow-up questions.
And Kara, I just saw another question.
Oh,
Can we,
sure.
if
Go
we
ahead.
have a moment?
Yep, we do. All right, Susan T was asking, would you consider linear organization of sentences and using active versus passive to be part of the plain language?
That's a great question. I think that, for instance, with active versus passive, just to recap for some, if you're not quite familiar with that, when a sentence uses passive voice, the noun that applies to the verb is obscured. So one example is that politicians sometimes like to say that mistakes were made. So you have were made, but it doesn't describe who made the mistakes. And so that's an example of passive voice. One way that you can check whether a sentence uses passive voice is to hypothetically add by zombies at the end of it. So for example, the sentence with mistakes were made, can you add by zombies? Well, mistakes were made by zombies. Yes, voila, that is passive voice. So as you might guess, passive voice obscures who the actor is, who the person doing the verb is. And so in that example, if they were, say, a government commissioner, and it would be clearer and more forthright to say, our department made mistakes rather than mistakes were made. So I think that, yeah, absolutely. Using the active voice can be a great way of making things clearer. And just to give another quick example of how this can apply to accessibility, perhaps you were describing that an attribute, perhaps aria expanded, was changed from true to false. If you had steps in a process that said, and the attribute was changed from true to false, that obscures who changed it. And in that example, if perhaps a beginner developer was reading that, they might not understand who has to change that. They might get the impression that, oh, maybe the browser does that on their own. But if you instead say, and then the developer's JavaScript changes this attribute from true to false, that makes it much more clear who's the one doing the doing. So I think that passive voice can be sometimes a bit thorny, and active voice can go a long way.
I love your tip, the by zombies. I feel like that may need to be added to your talk.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you.
No, that's a wonderful question. Thank you everyone for your questions. So we'll just wrap it up by saying that Accessibility Talks happens every month, and we'll have a new speaker next month, talking probably about JavaScript and React, and we're finalizing the details on dates and times and stuff, but keep in tune and we'll let you know. But thank you again, Ashley, for speaking today. And again, all the links will be up on the YouTube link.
Great. I had a wonderful time. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Yay. Goodbye.